Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of the ATACS podcast. We are adults and we talk about cool stuff. It is October 10th, 2021. I am your host today. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. Joining me are Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
Going pretty good.
And we have Ryan from New York. Are you ready to save the world today, Ryan?
Yes, and I am warming up my podcast brain.
Perfect. Well, I have a little more intro to get through so you can keep warming up. Today, we are having a deep dive discussion, spoiler cast, whatever you want to call it, about the game Wildermyth. This was an indie game that came out earlier this year. It got a lot of praise. All of us played it, and we're going to talk about it. And the main item of business to get out of the way up front is this is a spoilery discussion, if we want to call it that. So if there's anyone listening to this that doesn't want to hear anything or everything about Wildermyth, this is your one warning right now to leave, because we're just going to talk about whatever comes up. I think that's my intro, so let's just dig into it. And I guess I'll start with a kind of a very broad overview of what Wildermyth is, and either of you pipe in if I miss anything or misspeak about anything, because it's been a couple of months since I played it at this point. But yeah, I would say at the high level, it's a tactics game. Think your XCOM or your Fire Emblem or whatever. And there is kind of a strategic layer. So you'll have a tactical battle, and then you'll go out to like kind of this world map that has different regions to it, and you move between regions, and kind of you have decisions on what you do on that map and where you want to go and how you want to spend your time. And it operates on a calendar. You have days that pass and things will happen. So there is an incentive to move at a certain clip and not dilly-dally. So it's kind of an interesting structure, and we're gonna talk about that structure here. I think to me, when I first heard about this game, and this is kind of the first question I think I'll lead off with to you two, is when I first heard about this game, it was talked a lot. My understanding going into this game was it was kind of operating in this like D&D type of space. Like it's a video game, but it seemed to be trying to sell itself as like this, kind of an adaptation of like a pen and paper style RPG where you're like gathering up a party and you're going on quests and saving the world, and, all sorts of things happen along the adventure. Was that kind of you guys' impression of like what you expected going in? And I guess, like, is that what drew you to the game that led you to want to play it?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think I actually remember hearing some audio ads on other podcasts for this game that billed it as like a tabletop game, Dungeons and Dragons style role-playing game of adventures across the world with a band of heroes, and go through different campaigns and scenarios and see your characters grow and interact over time. And I think that is pretty much the hook for this game. So definitely what drew me in.
Yeah, I didn't know a whole lot about the game. I think I just happened to, maybe it came up, I think there were some sales mid-year where they were highlighting some new games, and it came up on like a Steam recommendation as overwhelmingly positive. I do remember, I think in the description, as you mentioned, that's kind of what they spin it as like a bit of a D&D experience, which And there definitely is a lot of focus on the character stories, although, the campaigns are pretty well set. So, yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but it did look pretty cool, and it was very, overwhelmingly positive, looked really good. So it's like, yeah, we'll give it a shot. And it was like on sale for 10% off or something.
Yeah, that certainly always helps. The other kind of table setting question about each of your experiences is how much of this game did you play? So it's got kind of an interesting structure where it has so there are 5 enemy factions in the game, and there are 5 kind of preset campaigns. I don't know if preset's the best word, but there's kind of like 5 set campaigns you can do. The first one's kind of, I feel like a tutorial-ish one, and it's 3 chapters long. The game operates in chapters, and then the other 4 are all, I believe, 5 chapters each. And then there's also the option to do kind of randomized 3-chapter or 5-chapter campaigns that are a little less structured, I would assume. I didn't do either of those. I did the first 2 in the list of the like kind of pre-made campaigns. I finished those to completion. The first one, the kind of intro-y one, I did on the normal difficulty, and I actually did check the Iron Man box because I had a feeling maybe normal wouldn't be that hard, and turns out it wasn't. So for that short campaign, I was able to do that Iron Man style. I have a funny story about the very end that we might get to later. And then the second campaign, I bumped up the difficulty but turned off Iron Man. So I went 1 above normal, not the hardest. But how much did you guys play? Like, what was your I guess time with this game? Like, what did you do? And that was all I did, by the way. I didn't do any more than those 2.
Yeah, I was pretty similar to you. I played the first 3-chapter campaign on normal. I did not play it on Iron Man, but I don't think I did any reloading anyway. And then I played the second campaign, which was against the robot enemy faction. And and bumped up the difficulty, but I didn't even finish that campaign. I kind of got burnt out about halfway through. I think I did 3 of the 5 chapters, and then I was like, all right, I'm good.
So I played 3 campaigns, all on normal difficulty. I played, and as you mentioned, most of them were not that challenging, although I think the last campaign I played, so I skipped around. I think I did play the Morthagi campaign, which I guess maybe was the second, and then I skipped down the list and I played the Thrixel campaign. I forget, the intro campaign is called Age of Ulstrix and focuses on the Gorgons. And then each of the campaigns seem to focus on one of the various enemy types, but I forget the exact names of the campaigns. The Enduring War was the Morthagi. But
yeah, I'm curious, if you skipped further down, did you find like a noticeable difference? Because the first 2 felt fairly similar to me. It's just the second one was a lot longer. As you skipped down to the later ones, did they also feel kind of similar, or was there any big changes to those?
There were a couple things that were interesting. I don't know that I would call it anything dramatic. It definitely felt harder. I think the way it started out, like or maybe the first season, you didn't have, or first chapter, you didn't have a base, or you had to reach your base. And you start out with 2 siblings as your starting characters, which was a little different. So you have to generate 2 characters who are family. And the story focuses a bit around them, which was kind of interesting. Nothing too dramatic, but they did tweak a few things in interesting ways. I felt like structure was pretty similar overall. I guess I did want to mention something. I probably should have pointed this out in the first table setting question. You were talking about kind of how the game was presented as sort of a D&D campaign, but I feel like the way that I think about this game is in terms of what it does, at least in my mind, as we talked about, the campaigns are fairly fixed, or they're fairly well structured. The stories, I thought the writing was good, but the thing that this game reminded me of is sort of like, if you've played a modern XCOM, which we've done spoiler casts on. I think we've done spoiler casts on the XCOM games, so we've all played the modern XCOM games. But XCOM didn't really lean into this, but it felt like XCOM kind of created stories for your characters, even though it didn't really put any structure until maybe some of the DLCs. So we could all probably spin a story about like a battle that went horribly wrong, or like, I had a character who was like a sniper marksman, and he was from Spain, and I had the language pack turned on, so he would always talk in Spanish, and like he had the code name Godfather. I had this guy running around and like the sniper running around and speaking Spanish, like assassinating aliens. So it creates these funny little stories, but really XCOM didn't lean into like actually building up those characters in any sort of way. It's just like the systems in the game and the randomly generated characters kind of naturally created these characters that you sort of you could imagine stories for. And it feels like what Wildermyth does is it kind of takes that procedural generation and like puts a bunch of story stuff to it.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, I think in the War of the Chosen DLC from XCOM 2, they did start to introduce like your characters could form like bonds and gain like team attacks, like partner attacks, and that created a bit more structure. But the way Wildermyth works, and the thing that stood out to me about it, is that you have these characters in these campaigns, and again, I thought the writing was quite good, but they get personality traits, they get unique characteristics. They usually start out pretty young when they join you, and then like as they go through the campaign, they can change. They can grow older, they can form relationships with characters you meet, characters you may not meet. Like they have stories that sort of reflect their personalities, like in the little comic panel sections or in the main story sections. And so as you're playing, like it feels very much like you have, even though your characters, like I mostly randomized all my characters and they were totally randomly generated, but it felt like they were kind of like their own personalities. Like it felt like you were following the story of like, like a more well-defined written character.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you guys felt that way, but that's kind of like how I conceptualized the thing. Obviously it's a strategy RPG. They do some interesting things with the combat system, and we'll probably talk about that. But just the thing that stood out to me is how it kind of took that concept of like, oh, hey, we have this strategy game like XCOM. It generates these sort of soldiers. They have names, but not really any other defining traits. And you can still kind of make stories out of that, like with just the way the situations play out.
Yeah, and like you were saying, they form those bonds and they develop their own individual personalities pretty quickly when you recruit a new member, or at the beginning of the campaign when you start with a couple. But they do it with a little bit of player control that I thought was very funny. It was effective, but it was sometimes really funny where you would like, the first time a character is talking in a campaign, you get like a couple dialogue choices and you're like, okay, this is going to set how this person is for the rest of the camp. Like, are they going to be the snarky one? Are they going to be the serious one? Are they going to be the jokey one? Like, it kind of like you set them an archetype right from the start based on how you make them react to an early situation. And then a lot of the choices you make for that character later on are like, how do they interact with this other character? And so they will sometimes form friendships or romantic relationships with somebody because you pick that dialogue option, or they'll have a rivalry or things like that. So like it ends up where as you get a chapter or so into a campaign, you have a whole cast of pretty well-defined characters that you understand where they stand on things because you've sort of set them on the path, but you don't make every single dialogue choice for them. You kind of just give them their archetypes and relationships, and then they develop from there. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's kind of and we've already started talking about it, so this can be our first main discussion topic that we're already in. But yeah, it's an interesting kind of middle ground between like a well-defined character that a lot of video games have. Like, it's not a Nathan Drake who's super well-defined, but it's also not completely freeform like actual D&D would be. Like, you don't have complete control over your character. They do kind of come with these stats, including like a whole weird list of like personality traits that, like, if you didn't go look at that list, you would never, it's not really manifest in any super explicit way other than just kind of like, I'm sure there's a whole elaborate system of like, oh, what dialogue can appear. Like if someone's heroism trait, I don't even know if that's a trait, but I'm just making something up, is above like 70, then they will say this line of dialogue. I have no idea what the actual underlying mechanics of all this is, but I would guess there's some intricate way that all plays out. So it's like, you don't really have full control like you would in D&D, because these stats, you never choose these stats. You never, the personality stats, the like combat relevant stats, you have more influence over. But the personality stuff and how they talk about, and how they talk in dialogue, you really don't have that much control over. But then you do get to pick some dialogue choices, and maybe that influences it. Is it part of the interesting thing about the game is it's never explicit on like exactly how what you do affects their personality. So it's kind of this weird amorphous thing that just seems to kind of evolve over the game as you do stuff, which has a really strange, I've found, storytelling style where it's like you kind of just do things without great reason a lot of the time, and things just happen. And I think, and in my read of the game, and what I think they were going for is they just wanted you to make choices that you thought were interesting and contributed to an interesting story. And like whatever consequences happen, like don't worry too much about it. It was more about the flavor than it was anything else, which sometimes kind of frustrated me because there could be like dialogue choices that could lead to different gameplay relevant rewards, but they won't tell you what it is until you get it. So like me with my min-max brain, I would want to like know what the the rewards are, so I'd know what choices I'm actually making. But I think they wanted to make it feel, their goal, I think, was to make it feel more organic than that. And I think that's where the D&D talk comes in, is like, when you're playing a game of D&D, like it's not as mechanical and pre-programmed as video games actually are. So I think they were like in a pseudo smoke and mirrors kind of way, we're like trying to get halfway to D&D. Obviously not all the way there. It's still very rooted in a lot of video gamey stuff, but I think this is my read of the game, at least, is that was kind of their main pitch of this game, is they wanted it to be something that could kind of generate, I think Ryan said something about this, as kind of a story generator. Like it can kind of just, through the confluence of all of, your dialogue choices and the kind of randomized character traits and the randomized events that pop up as you go through the campaign, like it's just hopefully going to create these interesting stories like pseudo organically with, dictated by the algorithm they've come up with. So, I mean, I guess the primary question and the obvious question for this is like, did you feel like this structure worked? Like, did it, I said pseudo smoke and mirrors, but like, was it effective at what it did? Like, I do agree. Ryan's already said that the writing was pretty good, and I do agree with that. I think the writing was pretty strong, which I think's kind of required. It's like the baseline thing that's required to make this work. But in terms of just like all of the events, like cycling in and out, and the stories that could piece together, like, were you guys into it?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. I mean, I thought it created a lot of really fun stories. I mean, I'm sure I could rattle off a few. It's really hard, actually, because of all the character connections. Like, and so the stories in some ways end up being kind of complex, right? Like you have this person who's married to this person, and they have this child, and these two, their friend or rival or whatever went on an adventure or had a side quest. Like it creates some fairly like complex scenarios and sort of like almost social mini stories or whatever that are kind of hard to capture or describe. But in playing the third campaign, I started to see some of the events recycle and I mean, obviously it's a video game and they have a limited amount of content they can put in it. So that wasn't horribly surprising or like immersion breaking or anything, but that gets into where I think some of the legacy stuff is pretty clever, where you can take heroes from previous campaigns and kind of put them into new campaigns if you so choose. I could imagine like someone who is really into this game kind of, continuing to do that. But for me, yeah, the first couple campaigns were really cool. Like a lot of the characters I thought were pretty interesting, and then the third campaign I also enjoyed, but I started to kind of see some familiar territory. Still saw some new stuff, but by that point, it's like, okay, I could continue to play this. I could continue to enjoy this. It is a very like well done strategy RPG, but I'm starting to see some of the same, not necessarily character arcs, but maybe some of the same characters being involved in similar events, which I had seen before. So that took a little bit of the magic out of like some of the things when they first happen, like when your character hits like a transformation option, and you can decide whether or not you go to this event that can really do some interesting things. Like, I guess, I don't want to jump too much into anecdotes this early, but I will throw out a quick one that was kind of like an aha moment for me in the game. So in the first campaign, probably within the first few maps, I had a warrior, so my warrior, I wasn't playing super carefully and I didn't understand the game's mechanics that well. So I put him in range of a couple enemies, and they both charged straight at him, and they both rolled hits with maximum damage. So it was kind of an unlucky turn of events, but he got knocked down. So it gave me a choice, right? It gave me a story choice. It's like, okay, does he die in a desperation attack, or does he retreat and live but have a permanent penalty? And so I took the penalty. I didn't want to lose him, and he lost 15 aim and maybe some other stat. Like, he took an aim penalty basically, and it gave him an eye patch for the rest of the game. And so that was kind of an aha moment where like, oh, hey, like, things can happen. Like your characters can change. So for the rest of that character, like in my roster, is still sitting there with his eye patch that he got from that first campaign where he like fell in a battle. So I just thought that was something kind of super cool that came up. Oh yeah.
Ryan's laughing because I just shared. I assume the picture I shared in our chat, which is lost on listeners, but I shared a picture I took of one of my characters who has a wolf head and a wolf leg, and I don't know if the tail is a separate thing as well. It looks like it, but the character just looks really goofy.
It's like 3/5 wolf.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looks like she has a pet as well.
Yes, it looks like it. Yeah, those transformations are interesting because they happen in really weird, story, beats that are just, they seem kind of left field when they happen. It's like, oh yeah, all of a sudden I have a wolf head. But yeah, that's kind of because I feel like and those things have gameplay, like combat ramifications as well. But yeah, I feel like, Ryan, you were talking about like, people getting married or having kids, and, you do get to see, because we talked about the campaigns occur in 3 or 5 chapters, and between every chapter, there's like a what is it, like a 10 to 15 year time jump. So when you play a 5 chapter campaign, if your heroes are starting at like 20 or 30 or whatever years old, or maybe younger, by the end of the campaign, like they're old and some of them may retire. It's actually a stat that they have their retirement age, and different things can affect that. Um, so by act 4 or 5 in a campaign, you can have characters kind of retiring or passing on. Um, so you kind of, point being is you kind of see the arcs of their lives, and so you see these physical changes, you see their relationships come and go, you see, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because you don't get that in a lot of video games, that kind of capturing that passage of time like that. So I thought that was really interesting. I will echo what you said about seeing repeat events, and I think that's my main struggle point, I think, with the narrative structure of this game, is even in the second campaign I played, I saw some repeated events. And I feel like that started to like expose some of the machinery underneath, and because I felt like in my first campaign, it kind of works. Like it's almost kind of magical in a way. And I really liked the narrative stuff, even if my gamer brain was a little frustrated with the lack of like, you don't know what you're picking, that I talked about earlier. But yeah, it kind of works in a way. But then I think in my second campaign, when I saw it started seeing like some similar arcs, or some similar like some repeated events, and it was just like 2 repeated events I got, but still, it like, I don't know, it kind of takes away from the magic a little bit. And I had a different character get the same transformation. I had, a different event that led to the same kind of reward or item, and it kind of like I said, killed the magic a little bit. But I also get that that's a hard thing to probably fully avoid, in this kind of game. And I get that they wanted the campaigns to be like, there to be multiple campaigns to play through. And fortunately, like, you can just play 1 or 2 campaign, and I think that's a pretty satisfying game right there. So I don't know that that's a huge knock, but it did, by the end of my second campaign, I was like, okay, like it was getting a little repetitive.
Yeah, I guess for the third campaign, I focused maybe a little bit, and maybe I was also lucky in not seeing some of the repeated events, but I can focus a little bit more on the main story, which played between 2 characters who are kind of brother and sister, and like, I pulled in one of the characters from my other campaign as like a legacy warrior, and he ended up being pretty good there, and it was like, oh, that's kind of neat. I get to have this character from my other campaign kind of live a new story, start from his youth or whatever. So there are some kind of fun things you can do, but yeah, it definitely does take a little bit of the magic out of some of that.
Do you have any?
For sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, I was just gonna echo some of what you guys have said. That first campaign I did worked really well for me. I thought all the narrative stuff was great. I really liked the writing of the pre-written scenarios that they kind of like stitched together, because as much proc gen as there is in this game, like the actual events and scenarios that you hit from moment to moment in the campaigns are very written, like very explicitly crafted, in a way that I think are really strong. But yeah, when I started my second campaign, I just didn't have the same like attachment to the characters, or I didn't care about the story as much. I think I just saw some of the same archetypes show up. I saw 1 or 2 repeated events, and I just wasn't feeling the combat either, which we'll get to. But for that first campaign, like you said, I think anybody could probably play 1 campaign of this and have a great time with it and get a lot out of it. Whether you play more than that or not and still continue to get more out of it will vary person to person, but I think there's a great game there for at least one campaign.
Yeah, and especially if you do a 5-chapter campaign, like they're not short. Like I feel
Yeah.
like I feel like the 5-chapter campaign I played took a good 10 to 15 hours, somewhere in that range. I don't know exactly, but they're not super short. Um, yeah, so maybe now is a good time to transition to kind of like the next banner topic, which is kind of like the strategic layer, so to speak, where you're like traversing around the map and like managing your time, and that's where the randomized events pop up. But this is kind of removed from the actual tactical battles themselves. It's like all the stuff you're doing between the battles. It's kind of hard to succinctly describe, so I don't know that I'm really going to try. But you're kind of juggling a lot of stuff. You have like the map is kind of broken up into these sections on the map, these zones or regions, and each region can have stuff going on in them. They can have enemies set up, or they could have a town or whatever. And there might be a river or a mountain range that like you could spend time like building a bridge over or digging a mountain through. And it takes time to travel to all these places. And as your party grows, like you start out with just like, 2 or 3 people, but as your party grows, you can start thinking about splitting up party members, and maybe you could have 2 groups going in different places. I know I did by the end of my 5-chapter campaign. I had enough people to kind of have 2 groups going around at once. So it's kind of in a way a lot to juggle. When I started my first campaign, like I actually found it kind of overwhelming because this is true for both this is especially true for this part of the game, also kind of true for some of the tactical battle stuff, but I did feel like the game didn't tutorialize a lot of stuff very well. In my first campaign on the overworld part, I was definitely just like kind of making my best guess and just kind of rolling with it, and just it was really a learn as I go type of thing. I don't know if either of you had trouble getting off the ground, and I can't even point at this moment, maybe because it's been a couple months, to like exactly what I struggled with early on, but there was definitely a hump to get over, and I did get over it. But it felt like a lot early on. Did you guys have that feeling, or?
Yeah, I definitely had the same sort of arc with it where I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing for a while, other than just march towards the next main objective, which, I mean, even as I kind of figured out more of the systems and what options you have available to you, I still kind of feel like maybe there isn't kind of a lot to do other than just march to the next objective. Like you can secure all the regions on the map, which sometimes you have to do, like at least clear out the enemy camps, but you could like spend time building up forts and defenses on every region and like exploring abandoned sites for additional resources, but like I don't really know that stuff is super worth it, especially because you're on a ticking clock, and the longer you take, the more just like enemies will start pouring into the map, and you're like, okay, I got to deal with these guys now.
Yeah,
so
and
I kind of. Go ahead.
I was just gonna, as like a extra clarification point. Yeah, this whole time you're on a clock, so everything you do is timed, and the longer you take, the enemy faction gets more powerful, or they can pop up and attack with a specific, like a new army will appear and kind of like roam through the map every so many days, and so you're definitely incentivized to move quickly.
Yeah.
So anyway, continue.
No, that's basically my point, is that you are incentivized to move quickly. You always know kind of what your main objective is, and the most efficient route to do that is pretty easy to discern from just looking at the map. And those extra things like building defenses or searching for resources just never seemed important enough to me. But maybe if I had played a full 5-chapter act, I would have seen some of those become more important later. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because like at the same time, it's like part of me agrees that like, oh yeah, like the rewards weren't always worth it. And you actually get a lot of choices, like risk reward type choices of like, oh, do you want to like every time you clear an enemy zone, you have the choice of do you want to I forget exactly what it is, but there's like a choice of like, hey, do you want to restore this quickly or do you want to take your time like searching the camp? And it's like if you take your time, you in theory get a better item, which seemed mostly true. Whereas if you do it quickly, you just get the basic resources, and
I
taking your
think
time
you're
gets you the basic resources plus an item.
I think you're
Um,
guaranteed an item if
yeah,
you um
yeah, and you know sometimes I would do it and I would get kind of a crap item I didn't even want, and sometimes I would do it and I would get a really good item. So it was it was a little bit hit or miss. I think the flip side to this is like in my second campaign, I pretty much always took the choice of like, oh yeah, I'm going to clear every zone and I'm going to dig for the extra item. Like I pretty much always on the risk reward choice did the, you know, took the took the risk for the reward. And I never felt that punished for doing so. It was like I kept getting like I don't know, maybe we'll get to this later, is that maybe the combat was just never punishing enough or whatever, but it's like even though the enemy faction was growing, it's like I always felt like I could handle it. So I ended up by the halfway point of that campaign being like, I'm just gonna do everything and take my time and get as much stuff as I can, and that felt fine. And I
I
don't
kind of I kind of wondered about so I guess on the first thing you were mentioning about getting ramped up, like I think my very first chapter I felt like I played pretty suboptimally, but and it's a tutorial, so I think it tells you about like, oh, you need to go capture this town and like kind of gives you the basics of the mechanics, but doesn't really um I think it doesn't really point out like securing zones and stuff like that explicitly, but by the second chapter, I think when I finished the first chapter, I was like, what are all these other areas? And I was like, oh, I probably played that suboptimally. Because it does, again, harking back to XCOM, like it has that XCOM campaign feel of, sort or any strategy game in that vein of like, okay, you've got a clock, bad things happen if you take too long. You've got all these hot spots or areas that you want to secure or whatever, and you have maybe some resources that allow you to do that, like in XCOM it's intel and money or whatever. So that basic structure I think was relatively familiar. And you had mentioned some things like the risk reward things. There were a couple points in the third campaign I played that felt a little dicey. I played mostly on normal difficulty, and I kind of wondered, like, on hard or a higher difficulty, would you feel those trade-offs more? I do agree on normal, and this is true of a lot of strategy games. When you play on kind of the standard or normal or lower difficulties, like, the game kind of allows you, even though there is, in theory, a time pressure, no matter how tough the enemies get, or no matter what's happening on the map, you'll just go beat all the battles, right? But I definitely could see like how taking too long could, because as you mentioned, every so often the enemies got like more powerful cards added to their decks, or like you mentioned an enemy army would spawn, and there were a couple times, like I think in the third campaign, where I was like, I really do not want this to happen. Like I'm not in a position where I feel like I've got a hero who's injured and needs to recover, or like, my heroes are spread too thin and I really want to secure this one area, but I'm gonna have an army spawning on this other side. So there were a couple very specific points. And again, I was playing on a lower difficulty where I was like, okay, maybe I should build a fortification here, or maybe I should, save the time, or I have to pull out of securing this area because I know there's going to be an attack on this area. So I think that's kind of what they're going for, but Yeah, definitely at the lower difficulty. On normal difficulty, there was just not really that much pressure um, to get ahead. But the decisions were interesting. I found that early in the campaigns, I like to search for the items more, even though there's a trade-off because you're more likely to get rings or accessories that you can't craft that give you like really helpful accuracy bonuses or speed bonuses or just super useful stuff like some of those random items. Like you can only find those items. You can't craft them like weapons. So early on when none of my heroes had any accessories, I would do the thorough searching to try and get, because it kind of didn't matter, right? Any item was a good item. But then later on, I would be more inclined to just kind of speed through things and just like, well, let's secure everything. And likewise with the enemy cards, whenever enemy cards are added, because you take too long, you can spend your points. You get these legacy points, and you can spend those. So whatever the main army or main enemy that I was facing, I would cancel out their new cards using my points. But the other enemy factions, I kind of didn't care because you might only encounter them one every 3 or 4 battles or whatever. So there were some interesting decisions in the campaign layer, I think. But yeah, I think without a higher challenge, like you don't really find those situations where it's like, okay, yeah, I've got an injured hero here, and my 2 armies are too small, or this army's too small to do anything, or the force that's coming in is going to be like, it's going to have 10 power, which means you're going to have to kill 10 monsters, and they're all upgraded or something like that. Like, you could definitely see those situations popping up in like a tougher campaign.
Yeah, and I do want to talk a little bit about the enemy faction deck system because I think it's kind of interesting, but I don't like it.
Yeah. So I was similar to Ryan, Nate, in that whenever they gave me a chance to cancel new cards with legacy points, I basically just canceled whatever was in the main enemy and more or less ignored the rest. How did you handle that?
So I think for whatever reason in this game that is systems on systems on systems, that was the one that my brain was just like, I'm not going to pay attention to. I don't know what this is. I don't really understand it. I'm just going to ignore it. And that probably is part of why I don't like it, because I just never really engaged with it. So that might be on me. But I got to the halfway point of my second campaign when I was like, all right, I'm not really feeling this anymore. I think I might stop. I'll try to end this chapter. And I think that I had ended up just like fiddling around on the map, spending so much time and not engaging with like canceling cards and stuff that make the enemy faction stronger or add new units to it. I think I actually did hit one one tactics battle that was like, this is crazy. Like nothing I've faced is anything like this. And I was able to win, but it was like the craziest difficulty spike I've ever seen in a tactics game, compared to everything I had seen before. And I wonder if I had just ignored the system enough that it finally caught up to me on hard. And I was just like, nope, you got it now. But I think that the system is kind of cool in that it like, you see the progression of the enemy factions growing over time. And every time, I might be misremembering the specifics, but every time you fight a battle against one of the factions, they add new cards to their deck after that battle, I think is right.
That sounds right, yeah.
And then also, if you take too long on the world map doing stuff, they start adding new cards.
Yeah.
Which started, when I started thinking about it more, I was like, so am I incentivized to not do anything on the world map and avoid battles in order to keep enemy factions?
I guess it's the game's way of balancing, I guess, the fact that you're always going to be getting new items and equipment and heroes. And so, that was a little weird that as you beat an enemy faction, they get stronger. And then also, if you take too long, they kind of throw in 4 cards. They're just like, okay, here are 4 upgrades, but you can spend points to cancel them.
Yeah, which
I don't mind. I don't mind that part.
Yeah, that part made sense to me because that was the main thing that made you not want to take too long.
Yeah.
I did the main thing. I mean, it took me a while to wrap my head around the card system 2, and this is not the only thing in the game that took me a while to wrap my head around, because I think it's one of the half dozen or so things that they just really didn't explain that well. The thing that would, like, I don't know that I ever really figured out with the card system was, like, sometimes when they would add a new enemy, a new enemy type, like a card for a new enemy type to them, and I'm like, does that really, like, am I still going to be facing the same number of enemies and the same strength of enemies? It's just a different type. And in that case, like, I don't really care. Like, I cared way more about the cards that were, like, upgrading enemies, like a level 2 of an enemy, because it was like, oh, that's going to make the enemy stronger, or, like, give them more health or more damage or whatever. It's like, those I didn't like. But when I was adding a new enemy, I was like, is that actually that big of a deal? Like,
Right.
I think,
because I don't know whether that increases the overall difficulty, unless it is like, oh, they get more enemy spawns in a fight, because that would make a difference.
Yeah, and that's the thing I wasn't clear on, if adding a new enemy type gave them more spawns, and I never figured that out.
Yeah. I mean, and this isn't strictly 1-to-1, but I think as you progress through the deck, the new types are, at least theoretically, stronger types. Because you get to the final few types, they end up being these kind of big, beefy boss types, and there is sort
they get more specialized or have stuff that's harder to deal with, whereas the starter decks for all the enemies are just like, this guy runs at you and tries to hit you.
Yeah, this is a wolf.
But yeah, I agree. I think some of that stuff is just kind of hard to understand or see the actual effects of. But to Ryan's point, I do think it is like an attempt to balance things without them just like auto balancing every encounter to wherever you're at the time. So it gives like you a little control over that push and pull, which I think is cool. But yeah, I don't know. The whole thing just kind of went over my head.
Yeah, building fortifications is another thing that I never quite understood exactly what it did or how it helped. Every time, like, one of the special armies came in, I would build fortifications where they attacked, but it was never explicit about what that actually did. I was like, this probably helps somehow. I don't know if it's causing less enemies to spawn. I don't know if it's like, I don't know what it was doing, but it was.
I think I figured that out because I was playing around a lot on the world map in my second campaign, which is why the decks got so strong. So I was just like building a bunch of forts and trying to see what happened. But I think it's like it's so an enemy horde or whatever it was called spawns with a strength value. I think that determines like how hard it is to defeat in combat, but also how far it can go across the map. And so, like, as it takes over a tile, it will reduce its strength by 1, but it will reduce it by more if you have more levels of fortification there. So, like, it starts at strength 7, goes through a tile with 2 levels of fortification. I think that reduces it by 2 or 3 or something like that.
Right, and I guess to that point, I never figured out exactly what strength does. My kind of assumption was quantity of enemy spawns, or maybe it's the stronger units might spawn or something along those lines, but I never mapped that out exactly. And none of that's necessarily super important, but it's those kind of things that were always a little fuzzy to me, and I'm sure it's possible to kind of figure it out and piece it together. It sounds like all of us kind of pieced different parts together. But yeah, I think the overall feeling I had was like, yeah, some of that stuff's kind of like, not super well explained. And for some of that's probably fine. Like, you don't really need to know what the strength number means. Higher is worse. That's kind of all that matters.
Yep. Yeah. And I think if you were to play on a harder difficulty, I mentioned, I ran into a couple of slightly dicey spots where I was like, okay, there's like a strength 7. I only have 2 heroes on this side. Like, can I throw down a fortification? Do I even want my 2 heroes to fight like this deck of 7 enemy cards or whatever that 7 means? Like, I think if you were playing on a higher, if you were really pushing for a challenge and the higher difficulty offered that, like, maybe you would really want to know that stuff. But I feel like at the level we played at, normal or maybe hard, like, it probably wasn't even a huge factor.
Probably not.
Yeah, I
The
do want
other
to make
thing that go ahead.
then you go ahead, and then I'll.
Well, I was going to say that the reason I wouldn't want to play this game on a harder difficulty than I did is because I think it would exacerbate the character imbalances that,
Oh yeah,
that I have bigger issues with.
yeah. We'll definitely get to that when we talk
We'll get
about
to
the combat.
that.
Yeah, and speaking of which, I do want to wrap up kind of this overworld part before talking about like character,
Yeah.
like the nuts and bolts of the combat and the character classes. But I got one comment and one final question before we move on. My one comment is that so my first campaign I played on normal, and my second one I played on the one above normal. There were 4 difficulties. Normal was the second easiest. So then I played on the third easiest the second time. And I actually had a way easier time on hard than I did on normal. And I think that was just because normal, I was definitely playing suboptimal because it was my first campaign and I was kind of goofing around with stuff or making my best guess on some things and like didn't really know what I was doing. And I almost lost the final battle because, yeah, I think I had just played suboptimal. And in the second chapter, I actually failed whatever the main objective was. It was a weird objective. I had like a very limited amount of time to like something was flooding. I forget the details. Like something was flooding, and I had a very limited amount of time, and I
You
just
have to
didn't get there.
reach us or secure a specific zone, maybe.
Yeah, I think so. Or else there was going to be like all this flooding or something bad would happen. And I actually failed that objective, the main objective, and the chapter ended and moved on anyway. And I think that like
Oh,
set me back. Like, it meant I had less stuff and enemy was even stronger and all that stuff. But the campaign still continued. Um, and part of that
cool.
was because it wasn't really clear. Like the time limit for me was not well communicated, but also like, um, just the way I was bumbling around, I was being suboptimal anyway, figuring stuff out. And then weirdly enough, yeah, my second campaign, I assume just because I understood the game better at that point, like I was playing more efficiently. And even though I was on hard, nothing really troubled me too much. But there is a difficulty higher than that as well. So yeah, I would think if you played on the highest difficulty, like you would probably, I'm assuming here because I didn't play on the highest, but you probably would need to be a lot more efficient with these things. The last question I'll pose to both of you before we move on to combat and classes and such is, did you ever split your group of people into like really small groups, like going around having like 2-person groups going around? Like I basically stuck with, because you can have up to 5 in a combat in a combat encounter. So I basically just had one group moving around the world map until I got to 6, and then I would split into 2 groups of 3. So as long as I was within that 5 group limit for combat, that 5-person limit, I stayed as one group. And then once I got above that, I would split into 2 groups, and I don't think I ever got more than 10 people. So I only ever had 2 groups. But I don't know, did either of you fiddle around with like, I don't know, having 3 2-person groups roaming around, or do anything funky there?
I would occasionally send a hunter. Hunter was the class name, right? Um, yeah, hunter. Off to scout zones because they do it much faster than other classes, which was kind of neat. So I would sometimes, if there was just like a 1 or 2 zone pocket off to the side that wasn't near a bunch of infested tiles or something, I would just send one hunter over there just to scout them out. But other than that, I mostly kept like a core group together that I knew could take on any tactics battles that would pop up.
Yeah, it sounds like pretty similar for me. I did, especially in the five chapter campaigns, you start to hit like 6 or 7 heroes, and then it becomes like, okay, let's have a group of 2 or a group of 3 that can still do some meaningful stuff. You also have to be careful because if you send a group of 2 through an infested tile, I think they can actually be attacked.
Yes.
But I do remember, I think it was in the third campaign, I was splitting my groups a little thinner than I liked, because I just had some map objectives I really needed to get done. So I think I had like 2 groups of 3. And I think someone got injured, and that person was kind of taken off the table. I was like, okay, well, this group really needs to navigate around the infested tiles, and can I have them build a bridge or do? There were a couple, but yeah, especially if I'm like pushing into a big block of like unscouted territory, it's like let's just get a group, let's get an A team, 4 or 5 really strong people, and not have any risk that things are going to go wrong in battle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I think now is a good time to pivot to kind of the final pillar of the game, which is the final thing we haven't talked about, which is the actual tactical battles and the character classes and just those kind of nuts and bolts. Yeah, so there are 3 classes. I forget the exact names, but they're basically warrior, archer, and mage.
Warrior, hunter, and mystic are the official names.
Yeah, which follow the warrior and the hunter follow fairly standard like type of abilities that I think you'd expect. Your warriors, your melee class. You have a couple options with weapons and gear for them. You can be like a sword and board, or like be more defensive, like tanky. You can or one of my favorites, you could get a spear with some longer reach. Or you could get like a big 2-handed weapon, which was great for shredding armor. So like you kind of get different perks. You can, play more defensive, more offensive with them. And then your huntsmen seemed like they were either going to be archers or like a dual wielding dagger or rogue type build. Which I pretty much, I always did archer.
Yeah. You use like stealth and traps and stuff.
Mm-hmm. And then the mystic is, it's kind of a mage class, but the mages work a little different in this game.
Yeah, they're cool, but they suck.
I don't actually. I mean, I'm no expert on the balance at the level I played, but I found that with the right gear and perks, like all 3 of the, like I had some warriors. I think warriors are great. The hunters were a little bit trickier. Those were ones I was maybe a bit more iffy on, but the mystics, I had some mystics like literally like blow up entire rooms of enemies.
Yeah, the mystics were interesting because, like, I guess to quickly say how they work is they infuse with objects around the combat arena, and then they basically cast spell type effects from the objects they've infused. So like you could infuse with a chair, and then like you could have the chair splinter into enemies near the chair or something like that, or you could infuse with a fire and have the fire launch flames at a nearby enemy. So you kind of have to use what's in the room. And the mystics were the biggest swings for me because like I would have situations where they were completely useless, and I actually had I had 2 or 3 times where there was literally nothing to infuse in like the area of the map I was in, and that I found to be very frustrating. It's like, well, I have a character on the map who literally can't do anything. But then there were other times where what it sounds like Ryan had happen a lot, where there were other times where like, man, stuff just lined up and the enemies all got in the right position, and I could infuse something and like do a really powerful spell effect and just kill like 4 enemies in one blast. And like every now and then stuff lined up perfectly and the mystic would be really powerful, but to me, the mystic felt very situational like that. It's like they could be anywhere between amazing or useless. Usually it was somewhere in the middle, but like they definitely had their moments where they shone.
Yeah, and I guess like one of the things that maybe is worth mentioning is that so obviously there are different ways to build your character, and each time your character levels, you get to choose one of like 3 perks. I think you get 3 choices, and then as Flex mentioned, you like with the warrior, for example, you can do equipment. You can equip each of the characters, and so that kind of guides your build. So like if you're playing a hunter and you take skills like does extra pierce damage or shred damage with ranged attacks, like you're probably going to be using a bow. But if you take skills like after you kill with a melee attack, you go into like stealth, or you're going to do extra damage if you melee out a stealth or whatever, like then you're probably wanting your hunter to be using like a dagger or backstabs or an axe or whatever. So there were different ways to build each of the different archetypes, and the mystics. The mystics had some things which I felt like alleviated their situational ability, but you kind of had to get those perks.
Right.
I think the one that I steered towards when I was given the chance is there's a skill called Ignite, which lets you create fire on debris. And then there's an upgraded Ignite, which lets you create fire anywhere. So that basically lets your mystic, no matter what's happening, unless I guess the ground is like totally blocked off or whatever, they can put fire on a square and then move it around, which was extremely powerful. Especially if you have, and this is true of all the character classes, but if you have them geared in such a way, I think for mystics, potency is the stat you want, which like boosts their spell damage. So if you have like a veteran mystic with like tons of potency, then like you can get certain skills that let you kind of, create something that you can infuse with anywhere. They did have a lot of interesting skill choices, and yeah, it was really hard to suss out, especially in the first playthrough, like what's good. Because it's like, for the mystics, it's like, there are different types of objects on the world map. And so their upgrade trees would be things like naturalist, and they get a bonus if they interfuse with, or if they take control of trees or whatever. And those skills I found to be extremely situational. It's like, okay, great, I have a really strong attack when I'm linked with a tree, but this map is like an indoor map and everything is like machinery or books or something that's just totally unrelated. So the mystics were definitely kind of funky. And then they had some other skills which were like buff your party members or something like that. They had some very weird skills. They have one skill where like if an enemy moves too close, they take some damage. And it's like, I don't know if that's really what I want to be doing with my mystic, but you could do that. I did have that skill. I had no better option one time, and there were a couple of cases where like an enemy got pushed or pulled through my mystic's like attack or like passive damage zone, and that was kind of funny. So I mean, there were definitely some interesting things that happened. But I had one mystic with a build where she could cause trees to grow, and then she had an attack where if she was fused with two trees, she could cause them to do this like massive explosion. But it took forever to set up because
trees.
It takes like a turn to like grow these trees. So like you just have to send their growing trees like to try and set up these attacks. It was kind of bad.
Yeah. So I actually had the tree growing ability on one of my mystics as well. I don't know that I got the tree exploding part of it unless that was within the same ability. But one of the things that kind of frustrated me about the mystics as well is like, it did feel like they always needed more setup than the other classes. So like, yeah, it like would take a turn basically to grow the tree. And it was nice to have the option to grow the tree, because if you ran out of other stuff to infuse, it's like, oh, you could grow the tree and infuse it. So like you could always do something. But like managing, because each character each turn has a certain number of actions to do. You have like a move action and a main action and a bonus, and I forget all the specifics of that, but like it takes some form of action to do like the infusing and uninfusing and growing trees, and like all of these things take action. So like I definitely it wasn't that common, but every now and then I would have a turn with a mystic where I would have to spend the whole turn like, all right, I'm going to uninfuse with this because I've met my infuse limit, and now I'm going to move over here, and then I'm going to infuse with this, and I'm not actually doing an attack this turn because I spent kind of the whole turn managing these things. I think that was the other part that like kind of tripped me up with the mystic. Like I almost wish this, specifically the uninfuse or whatever it was called, was just a free action that didn't cost anything, because if you move to like a new room, you have to like get rid of all your old infusions if you have any left. Um,
Yep.
but yeah, and I think the other, and this applies to all the classes, and I don't know if this is purely random or if it's determined by the skills you already have or some other like character or personality traits, but like you mentioned, Ryan, that or someone mentioned when you level up, you get to choose between 3 or 4 abilities, whatever it is. And I don't know if those were just randomized or what, but it was like they're clearly drawing from a larger pool than just those 3 or 4. Because so like I might have 2 warriors and they both level up to level 2, and I'd have completely different options to pick from. So like I feel like that sometimes made it hard to kind of like intentionally make character builds. You kind of had to go with the options you get, and you might pick one option thinking like, oh, I want to build in this direction, and then you kind of wouldn't get the other options. Like I had this happen at least once with a warrior where it was like, oh, I want these 2 abilities because I think they'd go well together, and I had seen them in my previous campaign. So this was more in the second campaign for me after I'd seen some abilities in the first campaign. And then I'd see one, get it, and then hoping to get the other one, and then it would never show up. So it was like, it was a little bit frustrating to me that it was kind of hard to build characters in that way. And I think that's fine in some ways, in the sense that like kind of like what we were talking about with the narrative stuff is like, I think they kind of want the character building to be a little bit more like, you don't have perfect control to min max things. You're not going to build the perfect warrior every time. Like some warriors are going to just end up through no real choice of your own being better than others because of the choices you get. So I kind of feel like that's what they were going for, but it definitely kind of annoyed my min max gamer brain of like, oh, I really want this other ability. They're just not giving it to me.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that Mystic who had the like damage field, like when an enemy comes too close. The reason I took that is because that was just a level up with like no other good skills.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, and I guess that gets into the legacy system where like when you play through a campaign with a hero, you get to maybe select certain things, or like they're more likely to see skills that they've already seen. So I guess that maybe is a way that they kind of like eventually, if you were to keep playing through, you could kind of keep your more customized heroes.
Right.
But yeah, I do. It was an interesting thing. It did make. I kind of like it in a way because, there's. I guess it creates some variance. But there were definitely some times where it's like, yeah, I want this guy to be like a melee hunter, but I never could get the combination of like, the skills that give more movement and the skills that give like go into stealth when you kill an enemy or whatever. Like there was always this combination that I kind of knew about that I could never really line up.
I will say that pretty much every warrior I made though was a murdering machine.
Yeah, warriors are OP.
Yeah, like I had some crazy combinations come together, and warriors in particular. It seemed like we're more likely to get those.
Yeah, I had one warrior that just had a spear, and I don't remember if this was gear or a skill or something, but increased the range an extra one so they could reach 3 squares from them.
An ability that does that increases the range of all attacks by 1. So yeah, with a spear you have a range of 3 squares.
Yeah, and then I also had skills that let them take multiple opportunity attacks per turn. So I would just have them out front with like this huge range, and anything that moved would just get, poked. So every enemy was just getting hit really hard off the bat. And then I had I kind of went down the defensive gear path, like armor path for them. So they had good armor and defense and everything. Yeah, and then had my wolf character actually, wolf warrior. It's just really strong offense because like I gave her an axe that could, shred enemy armor, which is the whole mechanic with armor. But then also like one of the wolf attacks could also shred armor, so it's like she could just get in there and like really shred a bunch of armor. And I think I gave her some like bonus attack as like a skill to level up that also gave extra armor or shredded more armor. So yeah, like warriors just seem to have a lot of different types of builds you could go down, but they just all seemed good. Like I felt towards the end of my second campaign, I'm like, I feel like my ideal 5-person party is like 3 or 4 warriors and then a mystic.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's I had one archer that turned out pretty good that had like could pierce and like I forget if it was crits or whatever else, but like had a high chance of dealing. I guess it was just high crit chance or whatever, but is like they could pierce and line up enemies and like really hit through multiple enemies in one shot and often got high damage shots. But like a lot of my archers I felt like weren't that great.
I
I never had good luck with hunters. I felt like at best they would just do some like very minimal passive damage from the back line, and sometimes go into stealth to like flank somebody. That was like the best I ever got out of them.
It was tough. I had a couple of melee hunters who were pretty strong, and but I did find because the archers were mostly single target damage, unless I guess
Yeah.
maybe you get some special skills, and there are definitely some maps where it's like there are just so many enemies flooding in that I really need like my warrior position to take multiple opportunity attacks, or like there's like the skill battle dance which lets you attack and then take another attack.
Mhm.
Or then your mystics like could set up these kind of explosions or like cones or whatever, and then you have your if you're doing ranged archer, it's like, well, they're safe, but they're going to hit one thing and maybe not even kill it because sometimes their damage just isn't even that impressive. The melee hunters, you could set them up with tons of movement, and then the stealth kind of made them really hard. It made them a lot safer. And then like if you had like a knife or an axe, like you could like backstab for a ton of damage. So there were definitely some cases. It was hard though because you didn't want to overextend them and get them into a really dicey situation and just to kill something big. There were a couple cases where I used melee hunters. They're like, I think late in the Morthagi campaign, there's an enemy that like spawns other enemies. And so the safest thing to do is like kind of weaken it from long range, and then have a hunter like sneak in and like backstab it to death. So I did have some success there, but yeah, the hunters were definitely a lot trickier. I also would have my melee hunters carry a throwing weapon in their offhand, which was kind of cool. So I think the throwing weapons were quick actions, and you got like usually a couple shots per battle. So that would help offset the fact that they couldn't always do multiple attacks. So it'd be like, I'd have my melee hunter like throw a knife and kill like a weakened enemy, and then like spin around and like backstab something really big, and like, or shred its armor with an axe or whatever. And then it's like, okay, well, this actually works out pretty well. Yeah, I mean,
I was never really brave enough to try melee hunters because the times when I would get overwhelmed and a hunter would get attacked, it was like, oh, they always die in one hit. So like I didn't want them to be in melee for any reason.
Yeah, there were definitely
I
matches.
guess if you're using stealth and stuff well, maybe it works. I don't know. I never really tried it.
There were definitely battles where like my hunter was like stealth in a corner, like not moving forward because it was just never safe for them to come out of the corner.
Yeah.
It's like, well, there are 3 enemies and they might not kill, the one or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which the heroes did felt pretty squishy, like the hunters and the mystics specifically. Like the warriors could get pretty tanky, but like even them, if you didn't have proper gear or armor or whatever on them, like they could go down pretty quickly as well. Like it was really about trying to not get hit at all. like making use of your opportunity attacks on your warrior, and then of course you're ranged on your other characters. Um, yeah, I have a couple comments on the combat and characters and stuff, and then kind of open it up to like any final thoughts on that before we start heading towards maybe some couple anecdotes and then wrap up the podcast. But one thing we were talking about with the on the overworld part, some things not very well explained. I feel like some of the stats were not well explained. It took me embarrassingly long to figure out that potency was magic damage, because I don't think that was explicitly like, even if you went in the menus and looked, like, I don't, if it said somewhere, I did not find where it said that that was just straight up magic damage. So like, I was giving non-mystics gear for potency, which was just useless for far too long. So my mystics might have been better had I realized that and prioritized giving the potency gear to them. Speed was the other really weird stat, and I've never seen a game handle speed this way, but like, speed is literally just how many squares on the map your character can move in a move action, but the speed could be a number like 4.3, and then you might get an item that upgrades it to 4.8 or something. But 4.3 and 4.8 still means you just move 4 squares, so it was a really odd system for that. And then I'll go ahead.
Interestingly, speed also affects your overworld movement, like the number of days it takes for you to move between. So
I know that.
I still did not know.
My melee rangers, I mean, it was just a powerful stat all around, but especially my melee rangers. That's actually one thing I didn't like about warriors. I would give the warriors the light armor because the heavy armor reduces their speed, and it makes them take like an extra 10 days to move across like 2 tiles or whatever. So yeah, hunters had that advantage where I would have some hunters with like 8 or 9 speed, and then, it would take them, they could just like fly across the world map, and move really far in battle as well. So, anecdotally.
Yeah, I wish I had known that. Which
I don't know.
That does make sense, though.
I don't know when I noticed that, but probably between using like heavy armor warriors and, melee hunters, like the speed gap is like, why does it take 50 days for this party to move from here to here? Well, it's because they have an armor warrior. If they move as a group, it's going to be the lowest common denominator. And if they have a warrior with heavy armor, like, it's going to be that person.
That's probably why I was stacking my enemy faction decks so much, because my army was slow crawling across the map with their fat warriors.
Both. I had a lot of armored warriors. Yeah, I think my only real other comment on the battles is, I think, other than a couple interesting character build quirks like the way mystics work, I think by the end of my second campaign, I was pretty fatigued on the battles because there wasn't a whole lot interesting about them. They weren't bad, but they're kind of like, if you've played tactics games before, they're pretty straightforward, other than a couple of those quirks. And you end up fighting a lot of battles, and that's probably a bigger point, bigger than just the battles themselves. But by the end of my second campaign, like, you grind, or like even on the overworld, like, you grind through a lot of zones by the end of 5 chapters. And I definitely got some battle fatigue by the end, and it's like you're incentivized to do them all, and like, really pay attention during the battles, because if you make some wrong steps, some things can go bad. But you kind of end up going through the same routines a lot. And I guess the final question about battles to you guys is, like, did you find them more interesting than I did? Did you get kind of fatigued by them as well? Or like, kind of where did you land on that stuff as a whole?
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I got pretty bored with them during my second campaign. Felt like, like you said, they weren't bad. There were a lot of them that were pretty samey, and I found that just the most efficient strategy in most of them, which were like just the random battles out in the field, were never hard. You could still get pretty punishing turns if you did slip up and put a vulnerable character out of position. So my strategy was have my mystics and hunters stand at the start position and have my warriors just walk forward and clear the map, because I just didn't want to worry about the squishies getting one-shotted, and I would just win all the like stock standard battles with just like one or two warriors clearing the whole map.
The warriors are really good.
It's so dumb.
Did either of you ever figure, speaking of things that weren't well explained, like I had characters who leveled up quicker than others, and I was assuming there's maybe some tie to like how many kills they get or something, but like did either of you figure that out more concretely?
So I was poking around on this Wildermyth wiki while we were talking, and I saw this, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to bring it up, but now I'm definitely going to bring it up because you asked. There's a chart in here for experience gain and promotion requirements, and it looks like the different classes just require different amounts of experience to level up. Like, the experience should be divided evenly between all heroes who survive a battle, but warriors just take less experience to level up.
Because
my
warriors always felt like they leveled up quicker, and I assume that's just because they were doing most of the killing, because my warriors were always my best characters, but that's really weird.
Nope, they just level up faster.
All right.
It's crazy. It's like, okay, so to get to level 2, if every class starts at 0 experience, to get to level 2, warriors need 20 experience, hunters need 30, and mystics need 36. So almost double for mystics. And that pattern pretty much holds all the way up.
Wild. And it doesn't understand. And it's not based at all, as far as you can tell, on how many kills they get. So even if your mystic was doing all the work, they would still just experience.
According to this wiki, at least, it says it's divided evenly.
Huh. All right. Yeah.
I guess from a spoiler cast perspective, obviously, I guess take all of our advice with a grain of salt. We did not play this game at a high level.
Yeah, fair. Yeah, which is why we described our experiences up front, so you know where we're coming from. Yeah, so I guess before we head towards the end of this podcast, anything else anyone wants to mention? If not, if we have time to share some character anecdotes, we can. Otherwise, we can wrap up this podcast. I'm opening the floor to whatever you want to share before heading to the end of this podcast.
I guess I'll throw out a quick anecdote. There are so many, and really, some of the more interesting ones to me are even hard to describe, because you have maybe the starting warrior who marries the first person that was recruited, and they eventually have a son, and she goes on adventures with the rival, so she's kind of friends. So I found that there are sort of these sort of almost social networks in the stories, and obviously a lot of it's imagined. I think that's part of the way but it was kind of interesting to me. But one individual character, I think this is not the most interesting to me, but sort of the most that happened to this person in a short period of time. So in the second campaign, I recruited a redheaded female warrior called Yanessa, and her recruitment story, she was very self-confident or whatever, and so I trained her as a warrior. Well, shortly after, there's an event where I guess there's this spell fount. This game is very seems like it has a very folklore sort of world building, but she's with one of the other characters. I think he's a mystic, and they run into this spell fount. And so one of the decisions I can make is to have her touch it. She's like, you can touch it or leave it alone. So I have her touch it, and so it causes her skin to turn blue. So now I have this red-headed warrior with blue skin, and I think it gives her some potency and reduces some other stat. Yeah, it has a minor passive game effect, but she has blue skin for the rest of forever, which I thought was kind of funny. Well, then maybe like a chapter later, she's becoming kind of like she's one of my mid-game recruits. She's gained some experience. She's a pretty useful warrior. Well, there's like again, she goes on this side quest, I think with the same mystic, and there's like a pillar of flame, and it like calls out to her. So again, she has the option, like she can touch it, or the person who's with her can kind of like pull her away. And so I have her touch it, and so it does the flame transformation, and like her left hand turns like fiery, and it gives her this cone of fire attack, which is based on potency. So this turns into this really interesting thing where over the campaign I have her advance the transformation, but then I also take skills and perks that like increase her range, and I give her more gear that gives her potency. So now she's still a warrior, but I have her use like the leap of faith attack because it lets her jump based on her potency. Because her like fiery transformed leg like slows her down, and her heavy armor slows her down. So I have her use this leap skill, which lets her move based on potency. So she's able to leap around and then like either shoot cones of fire or attack with her other hand turns fiery. So she can't hold a weapon anymore, but both her hands are like fireballs. And so I'm gearing her up with potency. So I have this warrior who's like geared with potency, who does all her damage like by like jumping around and attacking with like flaming. I just found
that's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah, it totally changed her gameplay too. It was a great story. She was a cool character.
The way that like having both of your hands transform to where you can't wield a weapon anymore as a warrior is very cool.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's like this. I feel like this game exists to try and produce those moments. I had a mystic who went through the lightning transformation, and by the end of the campaign, it was full transformation. So I think it's similar to the fire. It's just all of his arms and legs could emit lightning, and that led to abilities.
I think I saw that one. That's really cool.
Yeah, but it wasn't quite as interesting as your character because it was a mystic that got it. So it was like kind of more in line with mystic stuff as a whole. I mean, they still ended up being a cool character, but it is more amusing when it's that happening to a warrior.
It's very funny.
Yeah, and there are definitely characters that like I got attached to and like came to rely on in battle and that kind of stuff. And I think they do a decent job at that. I would actually be curious on the higher difficulty if like that let's take the anecdote you just described, Ryan, if like that situation works out on a higher difficulty, or if it's a situation where like, oh, it would have been nicer to have like more choice over how the character went for like gameplay reasons. I guess I'm like asking an unanswerable question of like the game's overall ambitions to like kind of create these character stories versus being a potentially difficult tactics game on the highest difficulty. Like that seems like a weird push and pull.
Yeah, it's something we didn't explore maybe in our playthroughs. And obviously, it would not be fun to lose characters. I had 2 characters fall in battle. I think I chose to have both of them survive with like a penalty. But you could also imagine you have a character who kind of develops in this way and then they just die, right? Like on a higher difficulty, like they fall a couple times in battle, or like you just decide that they weren't working out and have them kind of sacrifice themselves. I don't know. I don't know if the game offers the strategic balance that would create. Maybe it does. Like maybe it's just something we didn't experience, but I mean, having those characters fall in battle, I think we talked about the game can be punishing and have punishing turns. Like even on the lower difficulties, I was playing pretty lax that first case, but both enemies had to attack the same guy. It was my warrior who was pretty bulky, and they both had to roll kind of like max damage on their 2 to 4 hits or whatever. So stuff like that could definitely happen. And, it kind of created interesting story consequences, I guess. I don't know if that would be a good thing or if you would be kind of frustrated because it's like, well, I'm trying to beat this stupid thing. Like, this isn't an XCOM campaign, which is kind of like always the same thing, right? Like it's just the events and the random pieces are moved around. I guess it's more of a story campaign or whatever.
Yeah. I did enjoy the options you had when a character fell, and I guess the one anecdote I'll share is at the end of my first campaign, which is the one where I was playing suboptimally, so I probably was not doing that great with my characters. I did have a really good archer who could pierce and kill multiple squishy enemies in one shot, which was handy. But anyway, the final boss was actually like tougher than it should have been, probably because of just the way I had been playing. But the final boss ran in and killed my warrior, and like one of the options you have on death is to basically do like a really damaging like death blow. It's like your character dies, but you go out with a bang, so to speak. So I totally did that, and so my warrior, I was like, this is the final boss. I don't need this warrior anymore. So I was having a hard time with the boss and just sacrificed my warrior to take down the boss with it. So my warrior had a heroic defeat, and killed the boss with its final blow.
Yeah, that's always cool.
Yeah, so stuff like that can be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Well, barring anything else here, maybe we'll go ahead and wrap up our final thoughts. Nate, you want to kick us off? And what were your final takeaways from Wildermyth?
It's a game that I think is really, really cool, and I like a lot of the stuff that it does. Like I said, it worked well for me for a little bit, like I think it did for you, and then I didn't really just kind of didn't feel a need to play any more than that. But I don't think that really detracted from like the cool stuff that it does and the fun that I did get out of it. I just didn't need to play it for 80 hours, and that's fine. So I enjoyed it. I like some of the way they do storytelling, and the writing is really strong, and yeah, that's pretty much where I landed. Got bored of the tactics battles is probably my biggest like downside. They just weren't engaging me after a little while.
Yeah, how about you, Ryan?
Yeah, I guess I think we kind of touched on it, but I think the way the game did its character stories created some really interesting anecdotes, like and some stories about relationships and the way the campaigns played out, and like some of my characters seemed to be more jaded by the end, or had things happen, had things transform. It created, especially in those first couple campaigns, it created some pretty fun stories, like pretty fun. And it's really interesting to me too, just totally on a tangent, but how like these sort of strategy RPGs, both games like XCOM and Fire Emblem, like somehow you're in these zoomed out, sort of impersonal, you're like a general looking over a battlefield, but somehow you're like very invested and interested in your characters and like who they're like dating, who they're like hanging out with. Like, I don't know why that is, but just as a total tangent, I think it's funny that this type of game sort of makes those character stories and relationship stories more interesting.
Yeah. It's like sometimes it's nice to have tea time with the soldiers under your command. Yeah, I think this game is. I'm sorry. Are you done, Ryan?
Oh yeah. That's
yeah. I think this game. I think it's a really interesting game, and I think it's an interesting one to like talk about and think about. I definitely don't like everything it does. I think it has. It probably sounded like I complained more than I intended to with this podcast, but it definitely, I feel like for everything it tries, there's also like something that kind of bothers me or something I got bored with, or Like, I think there is that push and pull between like trying to be a mechanical tactics game versus a story generator, and kind of the way a lot of those specifics blend can be kind of weird or hit and miss at times. But I do think the overall thing it's going for is really interesting, and I enjoyed playing the 2 campaigns I played. I feel like there's room here for them to like make a sequel that like kind of rebalances and gets stuff right. Like, this is a game I would kind of like to see a sequel for that reason of just, I don't know, could they kind of take the same idea and maybe lessons learned from this and rethink it in a way that maybe comes together in a way that I like more.
But also in the gaming landscape that we're in now, do you think it gets a sequel, or do you think it gets 10 years of updates?
Probably 10 years of updates and DLC. It probably gets like DLC campaigns. Like, that's probably how they would actually fix it, is like, oh, we're gonna, sell a $5 campaign that, has a different mechanics or balance or whatever to it that is basically your secret Wildermyth 2.
Right.
And I think the thing that could happen here, I mentioned XCOM a few times, and in the XCOM 2 War of the Chosen, they started introducing like character partnerships or whatever. You could have 2 characters kind of buddy up and gain like a team attack. I don't know. I mean, in terms of the future, I wouldn't be surprised if an XCOM 3 takes some ideas, or maybe was already exploring some ideas. Maybe not full on Wildermyth, like add a bunch of character stories to every battle, but adds a little bit of that like relationship building or something. Some mechanics that are sort of tangentially related. I feel like it's very interesting what Wildermyth chose to do. They're like, hey, this thing that I don't know if this is what the developers were thinking, but I could imagine them being like, hey, when we play XCOM, like, we kind of like these characters. What if we built a game that was like XCOM, but characters actually like have stories and have interactions? Maybe that's what they were going for, or maybe that was their inspiration. But that's kind of something I think of whenever I look at Wildermyth. Is like, maybe if XCOM just adds a little bit more, it gets a lot closer to still being sort of the core fundamental tactics game that it is, but with even just a little bit more, it starts to build more meaningful, memorable characters and relationships or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting space for like those types of games to explore. I mean, and Fire Emblem kind of has its own take on it as well, and like, I think Wildermyth had like a different angle on it that I thought was interesting. And even if all the pieces didn't work for me as well as I would like, as, we've hit on here and there throughout the podcast, I do think it's a really interesting game, and I liked that they tried this avenue. So with that, unless anyone has any other closing thoughts here, I think we're going to call that a podcast. Thanks for chatting about the Wildermyth. Thanks to anyone listening for listening, and we're going to sign off. This has been an episode of ATACS. I've been Flex, joined by Nate and Ryan, and we will see you next time.